Joining me now to talk more about the explosions in Boston and the security response is Michael Breen, Executive Director of the Truman National Security Project. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Was this a terrorist attack?
Well, Elaine, it's hard to say. We don't know what the motive was in this case, and that means we don't know if it was terrorism or an act of mass violence for no motive at all. Terrorism is typically considered to be, the threat of violence or the use of violence more likely against a large population of civilians for a political gain or political motive, no matter how deranged. We know very, very little about what this was. The police are going to be looking for signs, investigators are going to be looking for signs, the composition of the explosive, the type of casing the explosive was in, was this a homemade device? Certain types of explosives are considered to be signatures of certain groups. Hydrogen peroxide, for example, is a signature of certain Al-Qaeda affiliates. So those clues are missing at this point, but we simply don't know much at all at this point.
And based on what you're seeing and hearing, have you been able to glean anything about the type of explosion, some of the things that you described?
Well, very little bit, just looking at the video footage. Most of my experience with explosions is based on my combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, so unfortunately I'm not much of a stranger to urban bombings. This doesn't look like it was a particularly high-yield device. If you'll notice when you see the explosion, the windows around the explosion in the apartment buildings or hotels above the explosion site are mostly not shattered, mostly not touched. So that means that it's probably a relatively small device, something like a pipe bomb or something similar that could fit into a backpack. There are two ways that explosions cause damage. One is fragmentation, pieces of the casing of the explosive that fly through the air at high speed and strike people, like shrapnel, essentially. The other way is with shock effect. It doesn't look like there was a lot of shock effect, but it's very hard to tell from the video how much shrapnel there was.
Are you surprised that we haven't heard more about who may have been behind this, a motive? Because wouldn't you think that if someone is trying to make a point, some sort of responsibility would have been claimed by now?
Maybe. If it's the kind of group that, one, claims responsibility, two, if they had a political motive, which, again, I have to emphasize, we have no idea if they did. And the third point to make is this may have been the work of a single individual, in which case they may not be in much of a position to claim responsibility for anything at this point. They may have been on the run or even injured in the blast themselves. It's just really hard to know. Clues to that are going to be things like how was the device detonated? Was it a timer? In Iraq and Afghanistan, we got very used to running into cell phone detonated devices where one cell phone would be used as a detonator. Another cell phone would call that cell phone, and the electrical circuit completed by the call would detonate the bomb. So you could do that from some distance away. At this point, we just don't know.
You know, with all the security that we've had post 9/11, we're looking at a major city here, a major sporting event, things like this. I mean, we saw a ton of police around. How could something like this slip through the cracks or even happen?
Right. There was a tremendous amount of security around this event, highly professional. I have to say I have tremendous faith in the Boston Police Department. My sister serves in the New York Police Department. I mean, these people are doing everything that can be done. And of course, there'll be a follow-on investigation. One of the things that security organizations do, the military police organizations, is learn from every incident that they're in, whether they're successful or not, and improve. But at the end of the day, this points out the crucial importance of resilience. We can stop most threats. I mean, we've been in a fight against a number of terrorist organizations for a long time. We don't know if they were involved in this or not. But at the end of the day, destructive power, whether it's an assault rifle in the hands of a single deranged person who goes into a school or whether it's a bombing in a city, it's impossible to defend against all of these things. And that's just the brutal reality.
Can you talk about perhaps the investigation taking place right now and perhaps what federal authorities are doing? I mean, obviously you had the President of the United States address the nation, weigh in. He is on top of what's going on.
Sure, and I'm sure they are. This will be unfolding on a number of different levels. On the street in Boston, you'll have forensic investigators looking at each of the bombing sites, looking at the devices, analyzing the things we talked about, timing systems or no timing systems, how were they detonated? What was the composition of the explosives? What was the casing? Were they in backpacks? You might find torn or burned fabric residue around the bomb, around the site to say that maybe this was included in a backpack or something like that. So they'll be looking at that very hard. Meanwhile, you've got to believe that the Boston police, and there's a lot of evidence to say that the Boston police has more or less locked down the city and that they're conducting a systematic search for other devices. It appears that they've found more than one of these other devices. So if you're watching this and you're in Boston, one of the most important things you can do is try to stay off the street and away from public gatherings until we're sure that all these things are off the street and gone. Then at the federal level and also at the state and municipal level in Boston and the state police, they're going to be looking for chatter. They're going to be looking for signs in various extremist networks that they monitor, both terrorists, domestic extremists, all kinds of places, internet chat rooms, to see if there's any spike or if anybody's talking about this, claiming credit for it, or if there are any other signs that point to who's responsible.
All right, Michael Breen, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your insight as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Elaine.